It was 11:47 p.m. when Whitney Houston's limousine pulled up to the gates of Paisley Park. She wasn't supposed to be there. Prince didn't know she was coming. But sometimes the most beautiful music happens when two souls collide in the darkness, when perfection meets genius, and when the world's greatest voices discover they've been searching for each other all along. Whitney had been driving around Minneapolis for hours that October night in 1987, unable to sleep, wrestling with creative block that felt like quicksand, pulling her deeper into artistic frustration. Her latest recording sessions at Criteria Studios in Miami had been disasters. The songs felt forced, artificial, corporate manufactured garbage that had nothing to do with the gospel fire that had made her famous. Every melody sounded like someone else's dream. Every lyric felt like marketing copy designed to sell units rather than touch souls. She'd started the evening at her hotel, pacing the suite like a caged animal, calling her mother Sissy 3 times before hanging up without leaving a message. What could she say? That the girl with God's voice couldn't find a single note that felt real? That Whitney Houston, the woman who could make 90,000 people cry with a single sustained high note, was sitting alone in a luxury hotel room feeling like a fraud? On impulse, she'd told her driver to take her anywhere. Just drive. Maybe movement would shake loose whatever was blocking her creative channels. They'd been cruising the empty Minneapolis streets for 2 hours when she spotted the distinctive symbol that marked Prince's legendary home and studio complex. Maybe seeing where Prince created his magic would inspire something, anything, to break through the wall of creative desperation that was suffocating her. But when Whitney walked through those studio doors at midnight, neither of them could have predicted what would happen next. The security guard, Marcus, recognized her immediately. Those cheekbones were unmistakable, that regal bearing impossible to disguise. After a brief phone call to confirm Prince was awake and working, Marcus led her through the maze of hallways that made up the most famous recording complex in American music. The building was alive with quiet energy at this witching hour, purple-lit corridors leading to rooms where creativity never slept, where inspiration was treated like a 24-hour emergency room for wounded songs. From Studio A came the sound of a lone piano, melancholy notes floating through the air, like smoke from incense, each chord progression more complex and beautiful than most artists could achieve in their entire careers. Whitney followed the music like a moth drawn to flame, her heart beating faster with each step toward the sound that seemed to be calling her name. She found Prince at his custom Yamaha grand piano, still wearing his stage clothes from earlier that evening's performance at First Avenue. A purple velvet jacket with ornate silver buttons, black leather pants, and those iconic heeled boots that somehow made a man barely 5'2" tower over everyone in his presence. His fingers moved across the keys with the fluid grace of water finding its path, each note precisely placed, yet flowing with an organic naturalness that seemed to defy the laws of music theory. He didn't look up when she entered, but his music shifted slightly, acknowledging her presence with a modulation that somehow captured both surprise and welcome. The melody he'd been playing took on a warmer quality, as if the piano itself was greeting an old friend. "Couldn't sleep either?" Prince asked without stopping his playing, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly across the acoustically perfect room. "The songs aren't coming," Whitney admitted, moving closer to the piano, feeling the vibrations of the bass notes through the soles of her feet. "Everything feels empty," Prince finished, finally looking up at her with those intense brown eyes that seemed to see straight through to people's souls. "Hollow, like you're singing someone else's emotions instead of your own." His eyes held the same creative frustration she'd been fighting, the same desperate hunger for something real in a world of manufactured authenticity. "You won't believe what Prince said next." Prince stood up from the piano bench with that graceful, almost feline movement that made every gesture look like choreography, and walked to a wall of vintage recording equipment that represented the bleeding edge of 1980s studio technology. Neve mixing boards, Fairlight synthesizers, tape machines that cost more than most people's houses, all of it personally selected and calibrated by Prince to capture sound the way he heard it in his mind. "I have something," he said, his back to her as he adjusted knobs with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. Been working on it for months, but it needs soul, real soul, not the kind they manufacture in Nashville or Los Angeles, the kind that comes from someplace deeper than technique. He turned around, holding a cassette tape labeled simply with a date and a small symbol that looked like a teardrop inside a musical note. Want to hear something no one else has ever heard? Whitney nodded, following him into the main recording booth, a room that had witnessed more musical magic than most concert halls. The walls were covered in gold and platinum records, testament to the genius who lived and breathed music in this sacred space 24 hours a day. But what struck Whitney most was the intimacy of the room, how it felt like a chapel designed for musical prayer rather than a sterile commercial studio. Prince slipped the tape into a deck and adjusted several knobs with movements so practiced they looked like muscle memory, like a pianist finding middle C in the dark. Close your eyes, he instructed. Don't analyze, just let it wash over you. The instrumental that filled the room was unlike anything Whitney had ever heard, and she'd heard everything. It started with a simple bass line that felt like a heartbeat. Then layers of strings entered one by one, like voices joining a choir, building to something that felt like sunrise after the longest night of the soul. The melody was haunting, beautiful, and completely unfinished, crying out for a voice to complete its story. Underneath the obvious beauty, Whitney could hear something more complex, pain transformed into art, loneliness alchemied into connection. This wasn't just music, it was emotional architecture, building a bridge between hearts across the vast distances that fame creates between artists and their audiences. When I wrote this, Prince said softly, his voice mixing with the instrumental like a conductor explaining a symphony, I kept hearing someone else singing it. Not me. Someone with a voice that could make angels weep and devils repent. He handed Whitney a pair of headphones, custom-built Sennheisers that probably cost more than her first car. I think that voice was yours. When Prince handed Whitney the headphones, he whispered something that would change everything. Don't think, he said, his eyes intense with the kind of artistic passion that could ignite recording studios. Don't worry about technique or perfection or what anyone expects Whitney Houston to sound like. Just feel. Let your soul speak its truth. Whitney put on the headphones and closed her eyes, and suddenly the world disappeared, except for the music flowing directly into her consciousness. The melody washed over her like baptismal water, and suddenly she was 8 years old again, standing beside her mother Sissy in the New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, singing because she had to, because the Spirit moved through her and had no other choice but to flow out as song, pure and unfiltered and honest. She began to hum, finding the melody's emotional center, discovering where her voice wanted to live inside Prince's musical architecture. Prince watched from the control booth, his fingers poised over the recording controls like a photographer, waiting for the perfect moment to capture lightning. When Whitney opened her mouth and began to sing, wordless at first, just pure vocal emotion poured over Prince's instrumental like honey over warm bread. He quietly pressed record, documenting what would become one of the most extraordinary vocal performances ever captured but never heard by the public. The melody she created was heartbreaking in its honesty. It spoke of longing that transcended romantic love, of dreams deferred but not abandoned, of the particular kind of loneliness that comes with being celebrated by millions while feeling truly known by very few. Prince had written the music, but Whitney was writing the story with her voice, and it was the most beautiful conversation between two artists he'd ever witnessed in 30 years of making music. But the real magic was yet to happen. After 25 minutes of spontaneous vocal improvisation that covered emotional territory most artists never explore in entire albums, Whitney removed her headphones and walked back into the control room, her face glowing with the kind of satisfaction that comes from creating something purely for the joy of creation. Prince was staring at the recording console as if he'd witnessed a miracle. His usual composed exterior cracked open to reveal wonder that looked almost childlike on his aristocratic features. Play it back, Whitney said quietly, settling into the leather chair beside the mixing board. When the playback filled the studio, both artists stood in complete silence, listening to something neither could have created alone. A perfect marriage of Prince's musical genius and Whitney's vocal gift that transcended both their individual talents and became something entirely new. The music seemed to hang in the air like visible light, beautiful and impossible, and absolutely real. Prince's instrumental, which had been gorgeous in its incomplete state, was transformed by Whitney's voice into something that felt like answered prayer. Her vocals didn't just ride on top of his music. They conversed with it, argued with it, made love to it, created a dialogue between melody and voice that most songwriters spend their entire careers trying to achieve. "We can't release this," Prince said suddenly, breaking the spell that the music had cast over the room. "Why not?" Whitney asked, though something deep inside her already understood. There were some things too sacred for the marketplace, some art too pure for the machinery of fame and commerce. "Because this isn't for them," Prince replied, gesturing toward the world beyond Paisley Park's walls. The world of record executives and radio programmers and focus groups that determined which songs deserved to touch people's hearts. "This is ours." This is what happens when two artists trust each other completely, when ego disappears and only the music matters. The moment we put this out there, it stops being pure and becomes product. Whitney nodded slowly, understanding with the part of her that remembered singing in church before anyone cared about chart positions or Grammy nominations. In the music industry, everything became commodity. Everything became strategy. Everything got filtered through the grinding machinery of marketing and market research. This moment, this creation, was too sacred for that machinery. What happened next would remain their secret for decades. Prince walked to another cassette deck and inserted a blank tape, his movements deliberate and ceremonial, like a priest preparing communion elements. "Let's make another one," he said, looking at Whitney with an expression that was part artistic challenge and part invitation to explore uncharted creative territory. "Something just for us to remember this night." This time Prince sat at the piano while Whitney stood beside him, close enough to feel the vibrations of the strings through the piano's wooden body. He began playing a gentle melody in a minor key, something that felt like rain on windows and late-night conversations between old friends. Whitney leaned against the piano and began to sing, making up lyrics as the melody moved her, letting the words emerge from whatever place songs come from when they're born rather than manufactured. "In the quiet of the night, when the world has gone to sleep, some dreams are worth keeping, some promises we keep." Prince's piano responded to every phrase Whitney sang, creating musical answers to her vocal questions, filling the spaces between her words with harmonic colors that painted emotions she couldn't name. Their collaboration was becoming a conversation, a dance, two creative forces orbiting each other in perfect harmony while maintaining their distinct artistic identities. The song that emerged over the next hour was more intimate than anything either had ever recorded for public consumption. It spoke of artistic loneliness, of the price of fame, of the rare moments when creative souls recognize each other across the noise of celebrity culture and commercial expectation. But as dawn approached, they made a decision that shocked everyone who later learned about it. When the second song was complete, Prince and Whitney sat in the control room listening to both recordings back to back, letting the music wash over them as the eastern sky began to show the first hints of sunrise through the studio's carefully positioned windows. "We make a pact," Prince said, his voice serious with the weight of artistic conviction. "These songs stay here, in this vault, protected from everything that turns music into commodity. And we never speak ill of each other, no matter what happens in this crazy industry." "Why?" Whitney asked, though she felt the rightness of it in her bones, in the place where musical truth lives. "Because what we created tonight proves that music can still be pure, that collaboration can exist without competition, that two artists can create something beautiful without ego or agenda interfering. If we can protect this, maybe we can protect something in ourselves that the business tries to kill every single day." Whitney extended her hand, and in that gesture was every choir director who had ever taught her that music was prayer, every gospel tradition that said some things were too sacred for secular consumption. "Deal." They shook hands, and in that moment, both artists committed to something radical in the music industry, a friendship built on mutual respect and artistic integrity that would never be compromised for publicity, sales, or industry politics. Years later, something happened that proved their bond was unbreakable. Over the following years, their pact held firm through every industry storm and media frenzy. When Whitney faced fierce criticism from some in the black music community for her pop crossover success, Prince never joined those voices. When Prince battled his record label over artistic control, Whitney never commented publicly. But those close to her knew she supported his fight. They maintained their friendship through occasional late-night phone calls. Never about business, always about music and life and the spiritual dimensions of creativity. Prince would sometimes send Whitney unreleased instrumentals, not for collaboration, but as gifts, musical letters from one artist to another. The music industry speculated endlessly about their relationship. Reporters asked pointed questions. Music executives tried to broker official collaborations. But both artists maintained their silence, protecting something too precious to commercialize, too sacred to explain to a world that reduced everything to entertainment value. In 2012, when Whitney passed away, Prince was performing in Europe. Those close to him say he cut his concert short, offering only a brief statement. Sometimes the most beautiful music lives in silence. After Prince's death in 2016, estate administrators found dozens of tapes labeled simply WH, recordings that revealed the true extent of their artistic friendship. The Midnight Vault sessions proved something revolutionary, that two superstars could create art for the pure joy of creation, without ego, without commerce, without compromise. Their friendship became a template for artistic integrity in an industry that often prioritizes profit over purity. And somewhere in a vault in Minnesota, those midnight sessions live on forever, waiting like buried treasure, not for discovery, but for the right moment when the world might finally be ready for music that pure, that honest, that real and transformative. Because sometimes the most powerful art is the art we never hear, but simply know exists deep in our loving hearts always.